Transport and NDCs. I'd like to welcome everyone from around the world to joining our webinar. Again, for those who weren't online before, my name is Oda Eichhorst and I'll lead you through this webinar today. But before we start, for those who may not yet be familiar with the software, what you see is the panel that allows you from the Grab tab to see your settings, and most importantly for us today, the questions pane, which is where you can put in your questions to the presenters at any time during the presentation. And you're automatically muted during this session, and any questions that you want to post, please type them in and then press the send button in the end so that we can collect your questions throughout the webinar. For the agenda, we have about 90 minutes max, and after a short introduction and overview of transport and NDCs by Daniel Bongardt, we'll hear more about lessons learned from case studies that we undertook as part of a study that we did, which you can also find in the handout section of your panel. Under the handout section, you find the study is already uploaded and you can download it for your information. And then we have the Q&A session in the end. So we collect questions to both presentations as we go along, and we'll have a joint question and answer session at the end of the two presentations. Roughly, the presentation should take about half the time, and then we still have about 45 minutes for questions if we need them. So our speakers today are Daniel Bongardt. He's a project coordinator at GIZ and is currently heading the project called Advancing Transport Climate Strategies, on which I'll tell you a little more in a minute. And from 2011 to 2015, he lived in Beijing and coordinated GIZ's transport portfolio in China. And then as a second speaker, we have Edina Löhr from Ricardo Energy and Environment in the UK, who works as a sustainable transport consultant, and in her work focuses on sustainable transport policy advice to governments in Europe, but also in other parts of the world. And in addition, not speaking, but also available for the Q&A session is also James Harries, who's also from Ricardo Energy and Environment and works there as the principal technical consultant in their NDC team, supporting NDC implementation in several countries. And he's also contributed to the study that we'll talk more about in this webinar, and is also available for questions later on. So this webinar today builds on work that we've done and published at the end of last year. On the right-hand side, you see transport and nationally determined contributions. It's a case study analysis that we did of several countries, and Edina will present the findings in detail. And also what we did in parallel was looking more in detail also at the sectoral ambition in G20 countries, looking not only at the NDCs, but also their transport policy beyond the NDC. And we are happy to have this opportunity to present some of these findings today. And just as a little bit more background, this work was done as part of our Advancing Transport Climate Strategies, which is supported by the International Climate Initiative of the German Federal Ministry for Environment. And in this project, we work with the countries and the transport ministries of Vietnam and Kenya with a focus on emission accounting and also identifying effective climate actions in those countries, supporting them in implementing their NDCs in the transport sector. And at international level, we also work with other stakeholders on advancing MRV methodologies in this project. And with that being said, I would like to hand over to Daniel to give us the introductory presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Urda, for the kind introduction, and thank you to everybody joining today's webinar. I'm really looking forward also to the discussion later on. So I'm giving first an overview of transport and NDCs, and I will also talk a little bit about the question on how we can help on international level to raise ambition. I think that's very early work, and I'm based here in Bonn in Germany, and just a few meters away from the UNFCCC Secretariat. So we have the Talanoa dialogue this year, and I think there will be plenty of discussions on this on this question, how we can achieve to stay below the 2 degrees or even achieve a 1.5 degree pathway. And transport certainly is an important sector with increasing emissions. So we are very much interested in how the sector can contribute to this, and this is what I want to talk about. So I also would like to thank the support from the German Ministry of Environment helping us with this project and the study. And okay, I have to move my mouse to the other screen, I think. Okay, now it's moving. So just giving a snapshot into the future. We saw increasing emissions from the transport sector in the past. Currently, we are about 8 gigatons of CO2. And if you imagine 8 gigatons, you could roughly estimate that the transport sector from the European Union is about contributing 1 gigaton. And also China is contributing about 1 gigaton of CO2 emissions. So then we have international transport, which is almost at 1 gigaton. So we are having increasing emissions, and we saw that in the past in almost all countries. Even in the European Union, where we had decreasing emissions in many sectors, transport was one of the sectors that was still increasing. And if you look at the business as usual scenario, for example, published last year by the International Transport Forum, we see that there's very likely an increase to about 14 to 15 gigaton of CO2 emissions, which means essentially doubling of the current emissions. And the future growth is projected, of course, mainly in the international transport, aviation and maritime, but also in the non-OECD world, where there is huge increase of demand and huge increase of transport performances. But if you look at what we need to achieve, we see that a pathway in the transport sector linked to the 1.5 degree or 2 degree is much, much lower, and there's a huge emission gap. So we should maybe aim for below 5 gigaton in 2050. So which means certainly just maybe only a third of the emissions we are about to achieve when we follow the usual pathways. This graph is based on data from a study from the SLOCAT partnership, the Partnership for Sustainable Low Carbon Transport, that did extensive analysis and also is putting that into the international discourse that is now going on with the international Stocktake on this here. And the graph is taken from the G20 study that Urda just mentioned. So in order to understand better how transport is really contributing or included in the NDCs, we have to think and get a little bit more into detail of the what countries really listed and committed or contributed just before Paris. So we reviewed all the 162 NDCs, and so it's in total about 194 countries, I think. The European Union submitted one NDC for 28 countries. And if you look into those NDCs, it's very interesting to see the huge variety of commitments, not only in the overall economy-wide targets or business baseline based targets, peaking targets, emission peaking targets, and intensity targets would we see in the various NDCs, but also in transport. There's a huge variety of different approaches. So what we did is we looked at whether there's really a sector target listed in the NDC, and in total it's only 14 countries who have a transport sector GHG emission reduction target. Many in Africa, some in Asia, and so we don't see any in Latin America. There are some other countries who have included targets, but these are not GHG emission reduction targets, but other sectoral targets. For example, China listed in the NDC mode share target for public transport in major cities. So here we maybe have another 15 countries who have put in these type of non-GHG targets. However, the transport sector was listed by more than 170 countries. 87% have identified this as an important source of emissions and an area of action. So we can say transport is really very well considered, and the challenges related to transport is considered in NDCs. Secondly, we can also say that because 119 countries have defined mitigation actions in the transport sector, and that means that there is, for example, a policy or a measure stated that this could contribute to reducing emissions. Also on adaptation, even if we focus today on mitigation, also on adaptation, there are about 20 countries who have listed adaptation actions on infrastructure in the transport sector. It's less than in mitigation, but also in that area there is an increasing area of focus. So only few countries have not mentioned transport at all, which does not mean necessarily that they don't have any activities here. If you look into the area of policies and measures, and you try to sort it and link it to various categories, we would like to state that there are maybe 4 different types of mitigation actions. So we have many NDCs with infrastructure related issues, and we only counted interurban infrastructure like highways or interurban rail and so on. Then we have a big area on urban transport, and 67 countries have identified urban transport as in a priority area. Especially public transport was very well represented among these countries. And I think that also shows that there's an urgent need to work in the cities and the city level. The third category, fuels and vehicles, is also many countries who have listed these measures on fuels and vehicles. Could be fuel economy policies like fuel economy standards or taxes. Could be also biofuels, for example, quotas on biofuels in the gasoline that is sold at the filling stations. And also quite a number of countries, more than 20, have listed electromobility as an area of action where they want to increase their activities. Freight and logistics is also an area that is maybe a little bit less represented in the NDCs. There's a lot of emphasis on passenger transport. However, if you look at the infrastructure block, so railways and roads, they are also, of course, very important for freight transport. So this gives us an overview that there's a huge variety of actions in that. And so if we look at the actions which are sometimes only listed very shortly, just one sentence. For example, in Vietnam, there's a sentence that public transport should be encouraged, should be pushed forward in order to achieve a mode shift from cars to public transport. Then, so this means that we have not a lot of material on analysis here. However, if we look at the big numbers, I think it's interesting to state that most of the actions that are listed in NDCs you could call them like win-win actions. So these policies or measures are anyhow very high on the priority of the countries. They are, for example, in sectoral plans, they are in the strategy documents, and so it is assumed that they contribute quite significantly to reducing emissions from the sector. However, what is not in the NDCs is also interesting. So, for example, there are quite a number of transport actions usually taken by ministries of transport, and which have, of course, an impact on emissions. For example, like constructions of highways, long-distance highways. This will contribute also to increasing traffic, to increasing urban sprawl, and so on. These usually are not listed in the NDCs, even if, of course, sometimes road construction or railway construction is listed as a mitigation action. However, it is not systematically put in there. On the other hand, you have some actions where we assume that they would have larger greenhouse gas emission reduction potential, for example, like fuel economy standards. But in many NDCs, these are not listed, even if the countries maybe already have those type of standards. For example, in the European Union, Japan, and so on. So, and some countries who might want to work in this in the future also have not listed in the NDCs yet. So it is a situation where we currently have many policies and measures in which are assumed as anyhow have not a huge area of conflict between transportation ministries' objectives and environmental or climate ministries' objectives. And so the others maybe are not considered yet adequately. So this relates now to another question, and I've mentioned it before that we have transport-related national targets in some of the NDCs. So what we did is, and Urda mentioned the study before, we did a more in-depth analysis of the G20 countries last year, just before the COP. And we did that because these 20 countries or 19 countries plus the European Union, they represent almost 70% of global transport emissions. So of course, for achieving the Paris agreements, the G20 is a very important, or G20 countries are very important. So in order to limit somehow, we put a focus on them, and only Japan had a target, transport-related greenhouse gas emission reduction target listed in the NDC. But if you look into more detail and you also analyze sectoral strategies that have been issued by the countries, or you analyze the mid-century strategies, low emission development strategies, other documents where countries are working in order to reduce their emissions, we see that many more actually have emission reduction targets. In total, we found 8 out of the 19 countries had these type of target. And so we are from Germany, for example, in our long-term climate action plan 2050, there's a greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 40 to 42% against 1990 levels for the transport sector until 2030. Also, France and the UK have similar targets. And for example, in China, there are intensity targets for the sectors in the sectoral 5-year plans to be achieved after 5 years. So we have emission-related targets in many of the strategies, but they're not listed in the NDCs. So we could also say there's maybe some hope already that countries are working on it, but we need more convergence between the various documents and strategies. And it's maybe also important that many of those approaches are maybe put forward not by the environmental or the climate ministries, but by others. So getting back to this graph where we saw that there's only some overlap between the transport sector and the climate sector, we would state or think that sector targets might help to further integrate the two. And so in the end, if we would like to achieve so a decarbonized transport sector, then we really need to move together those overlapping objectives. And that maybe can help us a lot with more defining the sustainability development actions and the sustainable development targets for the overall transport sector. And if you look at the SDGs and you see there's also the SDG on climate action, climate mitigation, this of course quite in line with the international strategies here. So having more comprehensive and integrated sectoral strategies, including sector targets, also including GHG sector targets, might help for the next round of the NDCs to increase the ambition and also to discuss areas where currently we might not have included in the NDCs. So let me take the example of road construction again. If there's a road constructed just next to a railway line that has been listed in the NDC, this road may be not included. So we may help really to include in sector targets these type of contradictory developments, because if we have a sector target and we work on scenario development and emission reduction pathways, then we will also see the trends of increasing transport activities in other areas and might more comprehensively approach them. However, getting back to the actions, because in the end, a sector target is nice to have, but what matters to actually achieve your pathway are actions. So, and I would basically distinguish two types of actions. We need something that we could call a mobility transition. That means we really need to avoid distances driven, vehicle kilometers driven. We need to limit the transport demand, the increase of transport demand in terms of kilometers and distances. And at the same time, we need to push forward those modes and improve those modes that they have the lowest emissions and the highest efficiency. Let it be public transport, let it be rail for freight, and so on. However, even if we are very, very successful in that area, so assumptions today are that this might lead to a reduction of 40 to 60% of emissions. This graph comes from a presentation from Germany where there's a big discussion within the Climate Action Plan 2050, how we can really achieve a complete decarbonization, which would be in line with a 2-degree target. So, however, in addition, we also need the energy transition, and that means we need, of course, to have very highly efficient vehicles, which is expressed, for example, in fuel economy, and we need renewable energy in the transport sector. And with the option of electric vehicles, there's a great potential now to act and move towards an area where we have more and more renewables in that sector. However, of course, this only works if we have really renewable energy also in the energy network, and we need to sit together with the energy colleagues to solve that. So within the G20, we did that analysis to look at these various types of measures. And for the mobility transition, we identified 5 types. And luckily, again, here, there's some positive outlook, because in many countries, there is an existing legislation that is putting that forward. For example, on public transport support, also on green logistic, road charges, many of the G20 countries have policies in place. There's one area, and I would like to take that as an example, where there is almost no existing legislation, and that relates to new mobility services, which maybe occur due to new digital technologies, smartphone apps that help us, for example, to order car sharing vehicles or ride hailing services. And so in that area, there's currently not very stringent regulations existing that can push those developments into a low emission pathway. One example here might be very interesting, the new Act on Transport Services from Finland, which is really adopting old legislation, for example, licenses for taxis, for buses, and also for freight operators, and adjusting them to the new needs of more information. And very interesting is here that these new act links more freedom in providing transport services with the requirement to submit the data and use this data, or submit the data to transport authorities so they can make use out of it and help reducing or identifying the emission options. So this data is very important, how we will later see in Adina's presentation and in the NDCs. So when it comes to the energy part, we also see that there's quite a lot of existing regulation in the G20 countries. There's one area, again, that is less well represented, and that is the fuel economy standards for heavy-duty vehicles, for trucks. So here it's few countries who have it. For example, in the European Union, still we don't have that instrument that is very important, while other instruments might be available already. So just only to give you an idea about the emission reduction potential of the impact of fuel economy standards, I here refer to a study from the ICCT on the G20 that says that even today, with fuel economy standards, we have a saving potential of about 2 gigatons of CO2 emissions. And if we would have more stringent standards, that could be easily increased to another 2.5 gigatons of emissions. So in that area, so here it's, I think, very important in the long term to really act in that area and look at these instruments. So to sum up and coming to an end, I would like to put forward some suggestions for increasing ambition, also for having a discussion later on those. And I would like to refer to this more on the international level, because later Adina's presentation will be on experiences from countries. And if we're talking about recommendations, what could be done in the countries, maybe this is then the more relevant part, how to do that. But we now currently see the negotiations of the rulebook of the Paris Agreement that describes what the next round of NDCs could look like and what the requirements could be. So here, I think it's clearly interesting that a sectoral breakdown of mitigation targets would be very, very helpful, also to merge the different interests within the countries and help countries also to put all the emissions together. And this might include non-GHG targets. So it's not only greenhouse gas mitigation targets for the transport sector. Some countries might not want to have it, but it could also include non-GHG targets. So secondly, when we have now this Talanoa dialogue during 2018, it would be very interesting to really discuss a global long-term sector goal for transport, because a sector goal really would enable the stakeholders in the sector to sum up the emissions from the various countries and projections, and also see whether we are on the right pathway or not. So currently, there are some indications in IEA reports what might be useful for a 1.5 or 2 degree pathway. But I think this information is very important for transport stakeholders really to see whether we are on the good track or not. Thirdly, I would like to say we need, or we could provide as a transport community, maybe not the UNFCCC has not the mandate, but as a transport community, we could provide sectoral guidance on transport and NDCs, what's good practice. And so this study should be also a contribution to that, and we might need to work further on it. However, we should focus on these core benefits, what really sustainable development in the transport sector, and how we can merge a low emission pathway together with the development aims of all the countries. And this will include some backcasting scenarios for long-term decarbonization pathways, because sectoral guidance would really require also to think long-term, whether we are on the right way or not. And lastly, I would like to suggest that those countries who are very active and who are forerunners also should put heads together, like during the last climate conference here in Bonn, the Phase Out Coal Alliance was launched. So this might be a very useful instrument also to help those countries who want to move forward to also find others and partner with others to jointly take the challenge up. I think that's something that could be an option during the next 1 or 2 years to work on. So having said that, I would like to end by just showing again this picture, which shows the NDC cycle. So some countries might decide to submit NDCs in 2020 again. We have the facilitative dialogue or Talanoa dialogue now in 2018, and then countries will work on check their targets again. And this will be repeated every 5 years. So 2025, there's again another chance to submit targets and rounds. However, it would be, of course, ideal also to get to more ambitious actions already in 2020 and start implementing these actions. And we need the link to the transport sector planning in order to have that available. So thank you. That was my presentation. And if you want to learn more about it, you can read it in those studies, or I showed the slides already. You may want to download them or check them from the handout. And they're also further reading, more like short fact-seal style of way. We have colleagues from the Transparency Partnership who have forwarded one publication on sectoral implementation of NDCs and transport, and also the NDC Partnership has issued a paper which was authored by SLOCAT, the SLOCAT partnership on that. So there's plenty of further reading here. And having said that, I hand over to Edina.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel. Let me just quickly bring my slides up. Okay, perfect. Yeah, thank you, Daniel, very much for setting the scene and giving an overview what is actually happening at the global and the G20 level. What I'll be talking about now is some work that we did for GIZ on lessons learned from case studies. So that's specifically rapidly motorizing countries. And the aim of this work was really to identify suitable support activities for NDC implementation in such countries. This work is summarized in that paper that was presented earlier, Transport in NDCs, if you want some more detail on it. So, okay, let me. Okay, I'm stuck with here we go, with the methodology. So let me give you an overview of what we did in this study. So this is based on a case study from 7 countries. That's Bangladesh, Colombia, Georgia, Kenya, Nigeria, Peru, and Vietnam, all rapidly motorizing countries. And our analysis was based on a literature review, and that included the official NDC documents, any background documents for the NDCs, but also related policy documents and studies. In addition to that, we carried out stakeholder interviews where possible in person with national and international stakeholders that were involved in the NDC process. So what did we look at at this analysis? So a first point was the databases. So what was the data that was available? What was collected? Where were any data gaps? How was the modeling carried out? Then the political process. So which stakeholders were involved and how did they get involved in the process? And the final point is really links to other policies. So how does the NDC fit in with any other policies in the transport sector or the wider economy? So from that work, we developed some lessons learned. So that's experience during the NDC development that could be positive or negative experiences, but also anything that countries have done since the submission of the first INDC. In this presentation, we will primarily focus on the positive lessons learned. So what have countries done particularly well during the NDC, but also since. So first of all, there were some common challenges that all countries submitting their INDC faced. So this was really the first time that countries had to develop such a document. And furthermore, the timeframes were very tight. So the modeling had to be carried out in 4 to 5 months, and some documents had to be developed more rapidly than ideal. Then also due to these time and resource constraints, the countries had to prioritize and focus their efforts on the most dominant sectors. So for transport, that meant a lot of it was focusing on road transport and personal transport, and some other sectors or modes were not covered to the same extent. And also the time and resource constraints limited the extent of involvement of the stakeholders. And also what we need to keep in mind is that a lot of stakeholders were not yet up to speed with the climate change issue within their sector, so that also slowed down the process. If we're looking at the NDC documents, so the official documents that have been submitted, we can see that out of the 7 countries, actually just 1 country, and that's Bangladesh, includes a transport sector reduction target in its official NDC document. There are some other countries, such as Kenya and Peru, that refer to their background documents for the transport sector reduction potential. And then 4 countries, Bangladesh, Georgia, Nigeria, and Vietnam, list specific transport mitigation measures in their official NDC. So this analysis is very much in line with what Daniel presented earlier at the global level. So while transport is mentioned in the majority of the cases as a key sector, only very few countries set concrete targets or mitigation measures in their official NDC documents. So what are the concrete lessons learned? So first of all, the lack of transport data limits sectoral ambition. So I've mentioned that we looked into the data that was used, the data gaps, and that there were some data gaps in terms of modes and subsectors. But it's very key for a realistic assessment of emissions reductions to have a good database and good data management. And also one of the issues around the modeling particularly was the lack of transparency around the assumptions. So very key for a future revision will also be to improve this transparency. We look into some country examples. We have, for example, the case of Colombia. They had a very scientific approach to their NDC, and that was really because they had already done some work under their low carbon development strategy to look into mitigation potentials of different actions in the transport sector. And having such a scientific approach, it really helped to, first of all, highlight the relevance of the transport sector for the environment and climate, and to provide a scientific basis to underpin the need for action. And since the submission of the NDC, a lot of countries have implemented actions to actually fill some of these data gaps. So we have Nigeria, who plan to introduce a transport survey on road-based transport through a lighthouse project. And we have other countries such as Vietnam and Bangladesh who will collect transport-specific indicators to track implementation and the effectiveness of both mitigation and adaptation actions as part of their MRV system. So a further lesson learned is that the buy-in from key actors is really essential for ambitious sector targets. So taking sector targets forward means that there is a need for political leadership that actually push for it. So we have the example of Vietnam, where actually the very good alignment of the NDC with national strategies helped to actually secure the support of key stakeholders in the sector that would then proactively promote some of those climate change response measures. And in Nigeria, we had the case that the president really stood behind the overall NDC and really pushed this forward. Then the need for institutionalized processes, or specifically the lack for institutionalized processes, limited the engagement of the transport ministries during this first NDC cycle, really. Because a lot of the transport ministries were not familiar with working closely together with the climate ministries. And there's really a need to institutionalize this cooperation between the different actors in the sector. So we have the example of Kenya. In Kenya, the NDC is based on the National Climate Change Action Plan. And under this action plan, the sectoral representation is ensured through a cross-sectoral task force. And in addition to that, in the revision process of that climate change action plan, thematic working groups are planned, and as well as donor coordination meetings. In Colombia, they have also taken steps to improve this institution cooperation. So they have introduced the national climate change system, CISCLIMA, which really brings together national and international actors and different actors within the country. So this is, for example, a schematic of how CISCLIMA really works. And what you can see here is we have an intersectoral commission at the top, and then we have working groups at the sectoral level, territorial level, and foreign affairs for the international negotiations. And underpinning it all is really this research, production, and communication committee, which produces all the data that are necessary for future revisions of NDCs and other climate targets. Then the NDCs need to be linked with transport sector strategies. So it's very key that they align with strategies. That is not only important to get the buy-in of key actors, as I mentioned earlier, but also that some efficiencies can be obtained. So aligning it with other sectoral policies or any reporting to the UNFCCC would just help make the whole process more efficient. And it is also very key to align the timelines of different policies. And in the past, some of these alignments haven't happened yet, and concerns were raised. As a country example, we have Colombia. As I mentioned, they had already developed their low carbon development strategy, and as part of that, a national mitigation action plan for the transport sector. And having that in place already really helped to align the NDC with anything that was already there at the sectoral level. In addition to that, the Ministry of Transport supervised all the modeling assumptions and made sure that the policies were in line. Okay, and finally, there is a need for transport authorities to develop climate change expertise, and in a lot of these countries, this is not yet the case. And also vice versa, actually, that the climate ministries need to develop some transport expertise to actually be able to develop suitable targets. So yeah, for a successful NDC implementation, this capacity needs to be developed, but not only at the national level, but also at the regional and local levels. So looking at the NDC measures, and as Daniel also presented earlier, a lot of measures really focus on urban transport and personal transport, which often are coordinated through municipalities or regional authorities rather than at the national level. So capacity building or development at that level is really needed. In addition to that, one thing that a lot of ministries struggle with is the continuity, especially in climate change, which is such a new topic. It is very key to have the continuity within the team to make sure that the capacity development is efficient and sustainable. So let's look into some country examples. So I mentioned that there is a need for local level authorities to be involved and develop capacity. And Georgia was actually the only case study country where cities were actually key stakeholders in the NDC process. And actually 13 cities had already elaborated mitigation commitments, which were then considered in the NDC development process. Then we have Vietnam. So that since the NDC was submitted, the Department of Environment within the Ministry of Transport now organizes capacity development on climate change issues. And in addition to that, the Ministry of Transport has set up an internal working group around greenhouse gas inventories in transport in order to mainstream key climate knowledge. And finally, we have Colombia. So in Colombia, the Ministry of Transport, they have introduced the group called GATS, so the Group for Environmental Affairs and Sustainable Development, who actually are assessing currently the mitigation potential of specific transport actions. So these are some of the lessons learned, really, and from these lessons learned, as well as some on-the-ground implementation experience that we have at GIZ and Ricardo, we developed a number of recommendations. The focus here really is on climate ministries, transport ministries, and donors. There are other actors out there, but this is the focus for now. And also, we tried to align these recommendations with the phases of the NDC cycle that Daniel presented earlier. So for the phase 1, preparation of the NDC groundwork. For climate ministries, it will be very important to build transport capacities within their ministries to be able to coordinate with the transport sector, really. In addition to that, they should facilitate data sharing agreements to make sure that all the data that is collected through different authorities across the country are actually brought together and coordinated centrally. And then we have the transport ministries. So here they, as mentioned earlier, they need to build up climate change expertise within the ministry. And it will be important to establish periodic and recurring data collection processes for specific transport data that will be necessary for a future revision and to monitor implementation. Then finally, donors. So it will be very important that any support that is provided is in line with the NDC cycle. So it could also be a role of the donors to just ensure that everything at the country level is aligned, and it will be very key to facilitate this expertise exchange between transport and climate change within the country. Recommendations for phase 2, so that's the development and the negotiation of the NDC. So for climate ministries, that will mean to consider transport sector plans in the NDC development and develop transport sector targets really based on an assessment of the mitigation potential. Then the coordination between the transport sector and neighboring sectors will be very key. So for example, in the transport sector, it is really the energy sector that is very closely linked, and facilitate that exchange will be very important. For transport ministries, during the negotiation of the NDC, the main aim will really be to actively participate in the NDC development stakeholder groups. And then for donors, it will be a key role to give insight into best practice stakeholder engagement processes, and also to communicate sustainable development benefits on transport mitigation actions. So in the transport sector, climate change is not yet a big topic in some of the countries, but linking any mitigation actions with benefits such as reducing air pollution or increasing energy security, again, will help to get the buy-in of some of the sector actors. Okay, finally, the recommendations for phase 3, that's NDC implementation and the integration in sectoral policies. For climate ministries, that will mean setting up institutional arrangements, as mentioned earlier, and also to engage in detailed discussions on policy development and to advocate effective implementation. Transport ministries need to develop NDC implementation plans and also vice versa pull out NDC objectives into transport policies. And as mentioned, there is a need for local and regional level capacity development. So possibly getting hold of a capacity development program to ensure there is a rollout of capacity development across the country at the local and regional level. And for donors, finally, there will be a role to enable transport agencies to access climate finance, which is a big challenge in the transport sector, and also to support building a pipeline for mitigation actions to increase the number of bankable projects. So that could be through pre-feasibility studies or stakeholder consultation. Okay, so that's it from me, really a quick run through a couple of country examples. If you have any more questions, just drop me an email. Some more detail you'll also get from that paper that you can find in the handout section. Okay, and I'll hand back to Daniel so that he can walk us through the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you very much, Edina. And also thank you again, Daniel, for the 2 presentations. We now come to the questions part. But before that, I would also like to say, point out again that the G20 study we did together with Agora Verkehrswende, a German think tank on transport transition and mobility transition here in Germany. You've seen it already, I think, but I didn't point it out. So this was a joint study with Agora Verkehrswende. So now I would like to move to the questions. And there's a couple of questions for the first presentation. And the first one is actually on categorization of the quantitative assessment. And it says, it basically relates to how the categories for the were designed, and the question actually reads: is it possible that some countries categorize fuel economy in the energy sector instead of the transport sector? And I think this points to one of the things that we have come across with all the different analysis that we've also seen, that of course there is always different interpretations of these terms, but I would like to give the word to Daniel, maybe to get back to that question regarding the data that you showed on the number of fuel economy actions being covered in NDCs.
Yeah, thank you, Urda. Yeah, actually, it's a very good question. And in fact, it's a pain comparing 162 NDCs and trying to find some common ground here. I think just after the COP in Paris already, the SlowCat partnership did some quite useful analysis, and you can still find it online. And so you see there they have chosen slightly different categories, but in the end it's a very similar result. Related to whether a measure like fuel economy standards could be linked to another sector. In fact, I guess in many NDCs it was linked to another sector. However, we really screened the text of the NDCs. So we screened for the words fuel economy, fuel efficiency, vehicle efficiency, whatever. And once we found one of these actions listed, then we put it in our categories. So in the end, we did not miss really these type of actions and measures. So the question is, it could be linked to another sector, but so in our analysis, it's included, even if it would have been linked in another chapter, because many NDCs just don't have a transport chapter. They are so different and so heterogeneous that it would not be possible just to look at one section.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. I think this is clear. And so I would like to move to the next question. And I'll just read them out, and also to everybody, what I do is when I read them out, I also copy the questions into the chat panel so everybody can also read them, because sometimes they turn out to be rather long. So next question is also to Daniel. And it says, when you provided the differences between business as usual scenario and the state of the art scenario, did you assess the marginal cost increase of adopting the more advanced technologies? I think this refers to the first slide that you showed with the scenarios. And the question is, did you also assess marginal cost increase of more advanced technologies?
So unfortunately, we didn't do an own scenario analysis here. I have to refer to the ITF, International Transport Forum, ITF Transport Outlook 2017, published early last year. And so they did the business as usual scenario and projections for the future. And when it comes to the mitigation options. So this pathway is really describing objectives, what we need to achieve based on analysis from the IEA, what emission pathway for the transport sector would be suitable in order that the overall Paris Agreement and in relation to all other sectors, that we would achieve a 2-degree pathway. So these emission reductions are intended, they are not modeled, they're not a specific scenario that could be compared to the business as usual scenario, but it's more like currently a scientifically suggested objective or scenario pathway that is suggested. So we need further analysis of all the different mitigation actions, but it's difficult, of course, because it's for so many different countries and many have chosen a different approach. The SLOCAT partnership, again, did a very good compilation of various scenario studies. And for one country, sometimes they have found 5, 6, or 7 different ones with different scenarios and options. And of course, sometimes marginal costs are assessed in that, but it's not done on a global level yet. And I just would like to point out that these type of information will be published soon in the so-called Global Status Report on Transport Decarbonization that is currently being worked at, again, with support from the German Ministry of Environment through another project, and also conducted or facilitated by the partnership I mentioned before, the SLOCAT partnership.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for this response. The next question that I have is actually for, I think, all the presenters. And I'll just quickly put it in here. And this refers to how legally binding these are. Maybe Adina can have a first go, and then Daniel can add or maybe also James. And the question is, are the NDCs already legally binding? And what would you suggest to monitor and verify the achievement of pledges in the NDCs in the transport sector?
Okay, let me have a first go at that. So the situation is different for the countries. I mean, they become legally binding once they've been verified and put into national legislation. Unfortunately, I'm not at the I haven't checked recently, but we had issues with some of the countries. So Colombia was still behind, Nigeria, I believe, as well. So I'll ask also James to give you an update on that, because he is really working on the ground really with some of the countries. So he'll be able to help you further with that. In order to monitor and verify the achievement of pledges, I mean, the key will be really to have a really good, transparent MRV system and really check progress regularly. That is really will be key, and for donors to really help and set something up that is transparent and can be shared across. So maybe James, you would want to add something, especially based on your experience on implementation at the moment.
Yeah, thank you, Adina. So I mean, the question of the extent to which this is legally binding, I mean, I think in many cases the NDCs themselves aren't necessarily legally binding, but I think a lot depends on how the Paris Agreement is ratified in each country, and there might be differences between different countries. What I've found is that actually whether or not the commitments are legally binding is not necessarily the most important factor behind the rate of progress and the extent of progress that certain countries make. And we've worked in some countries where these targets, these commitments aren't necessarily legally binding as such, but there has been sufficient political will to mean that the country is progressing very quickly and really showing quite a lot of ambition in terms of implementing action plans and roadmaps to deliver these commitments. In terms of how best to track progress, I mean, it's a very difficult question to answer because there's so many different elements to it. I think, you know, we tend to encourage countries to think beyond emissions because a lot of this is about looking at the effectiveness of implementation and the extent to which actions are being implemented. And so when you look at transport, then it's about thinking of the policies that are in place and the kinds of metrics and indicators that can show you the extent to which they are successfully being implemented and the kinds of impacts they are having, for example, on modal share or the average fuel efficiency of vehicles, which can tell you a lot, even in the absence of specific emissions inventory data. So I think, you know, there's a lot that can be done. I think another important factor when looking at measuring progress is to think about the way that data is needed to inform decisions and to think about looking ahead as much as looking behind. And this is something that, you know, not many countries do, even developed countries necessarily do kind of consistently. But I think sort of countries are starting to think about what kind of projections they can make to see where they expect to be in the future in terms of transport policies and their implementation and the impacts that they are having on emissions. Because in many cases, if you rely solely on greenhouse gas inventory data to track progress, then by the time you would know that you're not on track to meet your 2030 targets, it might actually be a little bit too late to really turn the tanker and to take actions to address that. So I think it's important to be sort of looking back at what's happened to emissions, but also looking ahead at your best estimate of what you think will happen in the future based on the current policy mix and making adjustments to that policy mix if it looks like it won't take you on track to where you need to be.
Okay, thank you, James.
Maybe
Daniel, would
just
you?
one addition, very short. And this is because currently the parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they negotiate the rules and procedure, or so-called rule book for the Paris Agreement. And that, of course, also defines the way how countries are reporting on their progress towards achieving that agreement. And so that's very important to consider also in the next, or in the coming months, that there should be reporting on transport and how, to some extent. There will be certainly sections of the inventories on transport, but as James said, giving more information about the actions would be very suitable, and also giving more information about the assumed mitigation potential of these actions would be very suitable. So I think here we can build up on these biannual update reports and all the exercises that have been done in the past already, and put that forward again. So that would help a lot, I think.
Okay, thanks a lot. We stay with MRV because there's also was another question on indicators for MRV in the transport sector, and now specifically the question whether there is an example of indicators for MRV used in Colombia. I'm not sure, Adina, if you came across something specifically regarding indicators for MRV in Colombia.
I mean, regarding the MRV system, it is all a work in progress at the moment. So it is being coordinated through the Ministry of Environment, and they're setting up like a modeling tool within the ministry. But the last time I talked to them, it was very much a work in progress and nothing final yet. So I mean, they are very interested in getting things like activity data to really model particularly road transport, also to get some emission factors that are country specific. That is the actions at the moment, but they haven't, as far as I know, but I mean, the discussions have been in the past, they haven't set all their indicators yet. But I can come back on that question if anyone is interested in what the specific situation is at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Adina. We can also follow it up later with more detail. So then there's a question regarding the support of NDC development, and then there's a few more complex questions I'll pick up after that one. But first, a question to what is the nature of support that is being provided to countries for their NDC development? And similarly, what is support provided securing financing for implementation where NDCs were supported in different countries? Maybe Adina or James can give some input regarding their work, and then Daniel can also add from our side.
Yeah, maybe James, you can summarize what exactly we're doing to support countries here.
Sure. So if the question's about sort of what support is available, then I mean there is a lot of support from institutions like GIZ, World Bank, UNDP, many active institutions, and the kind of support that they provide really varies. In many cases, it can be technical assistance around sort of analytical work, for example, improving the evidence base, developing a better understanding of mitigation potential and different action, support for capacity development. But we've also seen in the last year or so or more, international organizations providing funding for sort of NDC implementation planning. And so we've seen sort of technical assistance projects in various different countries, many of which we've helped with, where the support is to help develop NDC implementation roadmaps, action plans, and often these are at the sectoral level. And so work that we've done, for example, in Nigeria or Bangladesh, where we have produced sectoral action plans for sectors, including transport. So there's a specific dedicated transport NDC action plan that looks at the kinds of measures that will be needed to be brought forward, to be implemented, to deliver the targets in the NDC, how that might be funded, how it will be monitored and tracked, and really setting out a kind of almost like a table of actions for different stakeholders and how they're going to deliver these actions. So there's quite a bit of work out there. There's also some support focusing more on sort of the project level. I mean, an example close to home for us is the Climate Finance Accelerator that happened last year, where we helped a number of countries, Colombia was one of them, with building capacity for developing a pipeline of projects for implementing the NDC and helping to develop bankable projects that the private sector will invest in as well. So, I mean, it's a bit of a generic answer, but really there's a whole sort of suite of support ranging from technical assistance and capacity building through to sort of project financing to support NDC implementation.
I think it's important to mention in that respect also the work of the NDC partnership that was launched in Marrakesh in end of 2016. And so I think if you are in a country and you are very interested on doing more and getting more support on NDC development in the transport sector and also implementing the NDCs in the transport sector, it's very useful also to contact the NDC partnership, especially if your country is a member of that. And there you have to go through the focal point for the NDC partnership, which I guess usually is in the Ministry of Environment, and say, oh, here's an interest, here's a need, we need to get some support on here. And then this partnership set up by a variety of different organizations. I think the secretariat is in Washington. It's funded through German funding, but also other countries are part of it. I think it's 70 countries at the moment, and so there will be some guidance and also help on where this support could come from in this specific context, because each country has different type of donor communities with different type of focus and so on. And of course, there are some funding programs from the German government. I have to mention the International Climate Initiative of the Ministry of Environment, which is helping in quite a number of bilateral countries to support not only climate in general, but in some countries are also on working on transport in that specific area. So getting in touch with my colleagues here in the country offices might be quite useful if you're interested in that. When it comes to the past, I think because the INDCs were brought up 2 years before Paris, and it was quite a rush into it. Edina has mentioned at the beginning. So there were a couple of projects that ad hoc provided support. I know from my colleagues from the climate department that they had a INDC support project, maybe supporting something like 25 countries. But of course, everything was in a rush, and it was very high time pressure to be ready until Paris or just before Paris. So that's something that definitely will be different in the next round because everybody's prepared now.
Okay, thank you to the two of you. I think there's really a menu of options for financing, and there's different avenues. So moving away from the support, here comes a very interesting question regarding strategy development, and this says, some countries have included the energy and transport sectors into a joint low-carbon strategy. For instance, in Costa Rica's 7th National Energy Plan. Could you point out some benefits and risks for such an approach? Maybe Daniel, can you give a comment looking back also at the slide that you showed that we need both the transport mobility transition and the energy transition in transport?
Yeah, thank you. Very good question. And so I think it's a very good observation. And in fact, I would already like to congratulate Costa Rica that they have a midterm plan until 2030, which includes energy and transport issues. I think it's very important to have both and consider both at the same time, especially a country like Costa Rica, where you have a high share of renewable energy already in the network. I think it's 100% almost. And so that really gives huge opportunities and benefits also for transport when you look into electrification, whether it's electrification of rail system, but also in the midterm, electrification of buses, which is a very good option in cities. Electrification of cars might take a little bit more time, as this is still very initial in many developed countries already, but for example, scooters or motorbikes, electric motorbikes, they may come up very quickly and enable us quite a number of change here. So I think key is really to consider this as integrated approach, and also harmonize scenarios, harmonize outlooks for the future to see whether we have enough renewable energy and when we have enough renewable energy, and also when the demand from the transport sector comes in. So if you only have 3 cars in your country that are driven by electricity, nobody will recognize them. But if you slowly upgrade the fleet and after a while you have hundreds, thousands or millions of cars, then this really is puts a difference also to the energy sector. So both have to think together to implement it. Regarding the risk of the approach, of course, the risk is always no action, that it takes too long and coordinating forever instead of having some low-hanging fruits. And here I may again also mention that it might be very interesting to look at countries here that position themselves as forerunners. And as you mentioned, Costa Rica. Costa Rica is one of 4 countries who was a initiator of the so-called Transportation Decarbonization Alliance, TDA. And so this alliance was soft launched or announced, I think they said announced here in Bonn at the climate conference in November, and it will develop into the coming months. And when I mentioned the Phase Out Coal Alliance, maybe this development of Costa Rica, France, Netherlands, and Portugal might develop into this type of club of forerunner. We still have to see how it will develop. But having listened to some of the speeches of the heads of states at the Paris climate summit in December, it sounds promising, because many of them mentioned here activities in that area, and there we maybe can also see this integrated view on the different sectors with high leadership from the heads of states on that could really help.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. So we have 12 minutes left and a few more questions regarding the level of ambition. And so I would like to take up the next question. Sorry, just moved away. What is the approach taken for increasing ambition of countries for implementation of NDCs, given that NDCs fall short of the Paris ambition? So what can we do to actually raise ambition in countries' NDC implementation, in particular in the transport sector? I think we have some initial thoughts about that. Daniel presented some, but maybe we can also get some feedback from our colleagues from Ricardo of their experience in the countries where they work.
Okay, yeah. James, do you want to start with that, and then I'll see if I can add something from our specific case study countries.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think, to be honest, I think we're still at the stage where we're waiting to see how countries really take this forward, and the results of the facilitative dialogue will really help. And I think some countries are sort of not yet at the stage. I think a lot of the countries we've been working in have been focusing very much on implementing the existing NDC and have not yet turned their full attention, the sort of senior levels, to thinking about the next steps for developing updating the NDCs and increasing ambition. Obviously, there are different options for how they could do this. I mean, they could look at strengthening their targets. They could look at expanding the scope of the NDC to cover more sectors. And there might be, in some cases, more detailed analysis they could do within a sector. So I can think of some countries that we've worked in, for example, where within transport, as Adina has mentioned, I think the focus has very much been on road transport, and for good reason, because partly the data was better there, but also because it's the primary source of emissions within the transport sector. But then some of the other sort of transport subsectors were, whilst not completely overlooked, maybe they weren't studied in such great detail, but yet there still might be some viable, cost-effective mitigation options in those sectors. So I think starting early and having time to do a more thorough analysis than might have been done in some of the INDCs, which, as we've heard, were in some cases done to quite a tight timetable, would be positive. But I think fundamental to all of this, of course, is data, and having good, reliable data. And I think that's one of the things that Adina mentioned as the lessons from the work that we did in these countries. And in many cases, countries will be limited. They might have the political ambition to go further, but they might be limited by not having enough data on some of these mitigation options and being able to cost them up effectively to understand how cost effective they are in comparison to other measures, for example, or even measures in other sectors. So I'd say that doing work to really strengthen the evidence base is important, and we have seen that in some of the countries we work in, where international donors like the World Bank, for example, are coming in and supporting projects that really help develop the evidence base, help improve the greenhouse gas inventory in certain key subsectors, to then give you the platform to have proper discussions about additional mitigation measures.
Okay, yeah, thank you, James. In that work that we did, looking at those case study countries, we also asked stakeholders what they thought are the key elements that will, improve ambition in the future. And yes, data collection was one of the major parts. It's really important to be able to quantify the benefits and use that in discussions. And this support from key stakeholders, it's really as soon as you really have data behind it all to justify things, it gets easier to get the support of the key actors to actually take things forward. A further point that was mentioned in a lot of cases is the synergies with other sectors. So we mentioned the energy and the transport sector, really use synergies there. And also just in general, a clearer plan what has to be done at the sector level, because as we discussed in a lot of cases, it was very high level, and not necessarily, the NDC not necessarily did have specific actions and specific targets. So some countries are now implementing targets at the sectoral level to actually ensure that ambition is increased there. Okay, Daniel, anything you want to add to that?
I think we go to the next question. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. And I think the point that Daniel already made earlier with the sectoral target as a means still is another element in this discussion. So the next one, I think, is also a little bit related to that, and it specifically addresses the Talanoa dialogue. So maybe Daniel, you could pick that one up as first. And the question is, how could the Talanoa dialogue help in addressing the capacity building needs in the transport sector at the local and regional levels?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think if the Talanoa dialogue really succeeds in involving the non-party stakeholders, which are willing to work on reducing emissions in the transport sector, then it can create, of course, quite a good, quite a huge number of ideas, options, good practices, and so on, so others can learn from. However, of course, it's very difficult if you have a very generic dialogue on the international level. And for example, we would have a meeting on transport in the Talanoa dialogue to discuss the various options. And in the end, we would have a number of stakeholders explaining the contributions, the possible contributions they can make. Still, we don't have a complete picture whether these contributions from different stakeholders, whether it's cities, whether it's private companies, whether in total they really would make up that we shift to the right pathway. It might indicate that we go into the right direction, but whether we are on the pathway or not, it's difficult. So I think this Talanoa-like dialogue also needs to be framed somehow through some generic analysis of the sector that is looking at the various initiatives that came up and they are conducted, and really trying to put together the numbers and see what's the contribution of these type of things. And I understand there's a huge opportunity for regions like the US American states like California, who want to do quite a lot of efforts in the transport sector, cities that commit, for example, within the C40 city network, and committed, for example, many cities committed for reforming their bus fleets completely into electric ones. So all these initiatives and pledges, they to also analyze them, understand what they can contribute to the overall thing. And so then draw conclusions on what this would mean really for the implementation modalities of the Paris Agreement, and whether we need to reflect on these approaches on the national level as well. So this connection needs to be made, I think.
Thank you, Daniel. Is there anything you would like to add?
Just one thing is, which we could mention. So at the moment, I think just a few days ago, the platform at the UNFCCC webpage for the Talanoa dialogue opened, and you now have time to submit statements on this dialogue and what you think is important to that platform. It's open until April 2nd, and I would like to encourage everybody who is here, who is working on transport and emissions, also to submit your ideas into that platform in order to be able to conduct this as a synthesis analysis later from the Climate Secretariat. I think that's very helpful to have that possibility to give input.
Okay, thank you very much. Yeah. I think this is true. The more people ask for it, the more relevance also it will generate. So we have one more question that we will pick up. I'll just mention it here because the question was for if we could suggest reading material on the methodology for modeling emissions from transport. And I'd just like to say that we will pick this up in the follow-up, and also provide some reading suggestions for additional material on the MRV side and the modeling side of transport emissions. And since
I show one on the screen because the very last slide order was on that one.
That is true. I would also like to advertise that upcoming webinar. And this is episode 3 of a webinar series that we are conducting together with the UNFCCC Secretariat on the Compendium on Greenhouse Gas Baselines and Monitoring, for which we developed the passenger and freight transport volume out of the Advancing Transport Climate Strategies project with the support of the German Environment Ministry, which was lead authored by a colleague from the Center for Clean Air Policy, and but is a multi-stakeholder effort, and many other organizations, as you can see, contributed to this volume. And we had the first 2 ones already last year on national fuel economy standards with the ICCT, and then on comprehensive urban transport programs and how to account for emission reductions of these interventions. And on the 22nd of February, we'll have the next one on a methodology for fuel pricing policies and how to account for emission reductions of those. And there'll be more coming up, as you can see. And basically each one covers a chapter of this transport volume. So there's plenty of material out there, and I'm sure Ricardo also has a few more publications that would be very useful, and we will include them in the follow-up email. And since we have now also reached the end of our webinar, I would like to take the opportunity to thank everybody again. For those questions who we might not have been able to answer, we'll see also to get back to you where relevant in the follow-up. And I would like to encourage everyone to download from the handouts the publication. And I will also drop in already the slides, so you could also still download the slides of today from the handout section, but we will also still make them available afterwards in the follow-up. So thank you everybody for listening in. We're looking forward. If you have any questions following this webinar, please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us. Either myself or Edina also showed her contact details, and we're looking forward to be in touch and to work further on these issues together. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.